I think we are good. It's 7:06. We can start the webinar. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for your patience. Thank you, of course, to the guests. I am Benjamin Fishman, Program Coordinator for Italy at the Heinrich-Böll Stiftung, and this is the first part of a series of events on the intertwine of racism and anti-Semitism in European societies. As agreed in the German Political Foundation, the HBS is committed to combating all forms of racism, discrimination, and hate, including, of course, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. These forms of hatred are sometimes manipulated to divide communities, and in certain instances, anti-Semitism is labeled as imported, attributing it predominantly to people with a migratory background, while downplaying its presence across all sectors of society. But by doing so, we lack a comprehensive understanding of an issue which is deeply ingrained in European society. So why are we talking about anti-Semitism today, and why is it still relevant? Of course, undoubtedly, data show that lastly, there has been a significant rise in anti-Semitism throughout Europe over the past few months, catalyzed by Hamas's 7th of October terrorist attacks. The significant number of civilian casualties resulting from Israel's response has further heightened tensions. Nonetheless, the current war in Gaza or any other event cannot in any way provide an excuse to violent attacks that harm any member of our societies. All too often, Jews are held responsible for political and military developments in Israel, for whose they bear no responsibility whatsoever. A fact that indicates how anti-Semitism is still very persistent in our societies. Deadly attacks on Jewish schools and shops, the desecration of cemeteries and attacks on synagogues are certainly the most evident ways anti-Semitism manifests. Nonetheless, the vast majority of anti-Semitic episodes are less visible. In the last few weeks, we have been witnessing uninterruptedly anti-Semitic incidents ranging from the accusation of Jewish holidays of being satanic in Poland to conspiracy theories, references on public television, such in Italy last week, and attacks targeting Jewish students on university campuses in Germany and France. Those incidents are not random, and they keep happening every day. And this is why we urged to set up this webinar. So how serious is this phenomenon in 2024? And what can be done to address, counter, and prevent anti-Semitism? Those are a few, I don't know if there are a few questions we will try to provide an answer today with the precious help of our distinguished guests. So in alphabetical order, we have Anna Makówka-Kwapisiewicz. She's a journalist, a social activist, a historian with more than 20 years of experience. She works at the European Network Countering Anti-Semitism Through Education. We also are very glad to have Benjamin Fischer. Benny Fischer, he's a German activist. He's the former president of the European Union of Jewish Students and the founder of the JSUD, the German Jewish Students Union, and much more. Brigitte Stora, she's a recent PhD in psychoanalysis, but also an activist, a journalist, and a writer. And she published a book a couple of weeks ago named Antisemitism et meurtre intime, Antisemitism and Intimate Murder. And lastly, we are also very happy to have Gadi Luzzatto Voghera. He's an historian, the director of the Centro per la Documentazione Ebraica Contemporanea, the Center for Documentation on Contemporary Judaism, which comprises an observatory on monitoring anti-Semitism in Italy. So I will now ask our speakers to tell us a bit about the situation of anti-Semitism today in their countries. What is important for our audience to know? Maybe if you can share some salient data or facts or numbers. And in general, give us a bit of what is the context, what is the state of health, if we can say so, of anti-Semitism in your country. So I will start by Anna Makówka-Kwapisiewicz. The floor is yours.
So first of all, good evening. Thank you for having me. Like, it's an honor to be here. Just an explanation, I will just add one thing in the terms of ENCATE. ENCATE is a pan-European network established by KIGA, a German organization, combating anti-Semitism through education, and it gathers 21 organizations dealing with the combating of anti-Semitism in the various European countries. So, and in the terms of Poland, when we are talking about anti-Semitism, analyzing the history of the anti-Semitism, in the pre-Christian times, there was not such a thing as an anti-Semitism. So it's give you the the perspective that that anti-Semitism came with Catholicism, Christianity to Poland in that regard. So that is how it started, right? In the terms of, and I will not give you like the whole history, like the lecture of the history of the anti-Semitism in Poland. It's not about that. But in the terms of anti-Semitism, like the situation is getting better. So when I was analyzing the first reports in the terms of anti-Semitism, like we can say that the anti-Semitism is going down. So when people are asking the terms like being openly anti-Semites, like more or less 30% of Poles would say that they are like having some kind of anti-Semitic prejudices or like feelings towards Jews, etc., etc. In the terms of conspiracy, terrorism, so-called of the modern anti-Semitism, it's more challenging because it's like 40 up to 50% those who will declare that Jews will have a power or control like the war media, etc., etc., which very compromised, like, and also correlates with the anti-Zionism as well after October 7. So, but like also what is very interesting in the terms of the sympathy towards Jews, which is growing, like more over like 60% of Poles would like be okay, like to have a Jewish friends or Jewish neighbor or work with someone with a Jewish origin. But on the other hand, like 40% would, so like we can see like 20% less would be open to have like Jewish members of the family or like the father-in-law, which who would be Jewish or someone else. What is very disturbing that 80% of respondents admitted that they have never met someone with a Jewish origin or a Jew or someone from the Jewish community. So like we are talking about something of symbolic of the symbol of the Jew, like of the affirmation of the stereotype of the prejudices which people would have in that regard. But it's what is very interesting in the terms of imaginary aspect of the anti-Semitism in Poland is that the newest research conducted by the Poland Museum last year, and they analyzed how Jews and anti-Semitism is perceived by the society. So what they've analyzed, it's like this culture code which are existing among the Polish culture. And like when we are talking about the Jewishness, about like the anti-Semitism, like so they are like the four mapping groups associated with the connotation which goes with Jews. So one is the suffering, so it's everything connected with the Holocaust. The second is the elevation, like the power, like so it's like that Jews have the power, just control the media, etc., etc., everything which goes with that. Another thing is the strangeness, the affirmation of the otherness, and also like the familiarity, similarity. So what is also very interesting that the suffering is correlates with the elevation of the power. So it creates something like the paradox, like the dualism. So it's on the one hand, there is a people feel sadness, that there's the connotation with the harm, with the Holocaust, but on the other hand, it still is a question of power of those. And also when we are talking about the Poland, like there is a sociologist or using the term anti-Semitism without Jews. So it's very like interesting in the terms of the Jewish community. As according to the census, there is not even 15,000 Jews living in Poland. About like going in the terms of the numbers. But what is also very interesting that like when I was analyzing last year, like 2 years ago with ENCATE, we've published the report in the terms of V4 countries, like, and the anti-Semitism here is like have the different connotation. It's much more politicized. It's much more connected with the political atmosphere. So like it's used as a tool, as a dog whistle to the voters, to the mobilization of the voters, or for the discreditation or destroying the credibility of the liberal voices connected with the human rights agenda. So it's enough to name someone that he's Jewish or like to show that he's not loyal to the country, like to destroy the credibility of the politician. So that is very interesting. So that is also the distinction between the anti-Semitism in V4 and also part of it is in Poland than from in other countries. So that is like, to keep the long story short, how it looks like in the terms of the numbers. Also, in the terms of October 7, like the hatred which evolves mostly in the internet towards Jews and towards the state of Israel, it's very connected with the anti-Ukrainian sentiment. So it's also very interesting that like the anti-Semitism is used as a cliché, and like the mechanism which is known, which is adopted by the culture, like to also blame in other groups, which the anti-Semitism in that regard can be used as a tool to attack in other vulnerable groups which are targeted by the hatred. So that is it for now. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Anna. And now we'll give the floor to Benny, because indeed the history in Germany is quite different. The work on the Erinnerungskultur, the culture of remembrance, done by Germany, is quite unique. So unique that some Germans think that they have worked so well on their history that there is no anti-Semitism anymore inside Germany, and it is all imported. As an example, if white Germans are accused of anti-Semitism, either it is denied or the accuser is being blamed for being obnoxious, like the recent example of Hubert Aiwanger in Bavaria. Also, in a recent conference we organized in Paris, Max Czolek also talked about these mechanisms of denial of anti-Semitism in Germany. So how would you describe the situation today?
Thank you, Benjamin, and thank you everyone for having me, obviously, and for giving a platform, well, to us in order to address this very important topic. I will try to go from the more general to the more specific in order to then allude to some of the things that you rightfully also mentioned in your intro, Benjamin. Very good examples, especially Aiwanger. All right, so when speaking about the German example, it's important to emphasize that we speak about, well, I will address Germany after 45. And maybe the most important thing to say at this point is that there has been a continuity of anti-Semitism, both in general society and politics, in political parties, but especially in all parts of society ever since 1945. There are plenty of examples, and it's also important to highlight that this was the case both in West and East Germany. Whilst both states had very different narratives around the role they take after Second World War, there are very good examples of how anti-Semitism played a crucial role. And obviously there are plenty of examples of anti-Semitic incidents, violent anti-Semitic incidents after 1945. Maybe the first thing that I would like to share with you is in fact a Wikipedia link, but I find this one to be extremely informative. I apologize that this one only exists in German, but it might give you an impression of what it is that I'm referring to. This is a list of all the violent anti-Semitic incidents ever since 1945. And I think that many people are unaware of the density and the intensity of anti-Semitic violence after 45. In the more recent past, it's, well, I mean, ever since, so between the 7th of October and the 31st of December 2023, pretty much the same amount of anti-Semitic incidents have been monitored by criminal authorities as in the entire year of 2022. So there has been an extreme rise of anti-Semitic incidents after 7th of October. The data is quite, well, direct in this case. And it's also important to say that there has been a bit of a constant when it comes to anti-Semitic attitudes within society at large. Roughly a third of Germans hold anti-Semitic stereotypes of all kinds. And then we speak about 11 to 12% who you know, could be seen on the very extreme. And these are numbers that have been basically constant. The one thing that has changed, though, is public discourse around it, for sure. And one of the main reasons for that is that the Nazi Party actually dissolved, but merged into what is now the far right. So many of those who were identifiable as clear Nazis before are now part of an extreme right, which, however, when it comes to public stances and or discourse, is no less extreme in some cases, maybe a bit more hidden. A few last examples that I would like to share with you. So first of all, the numbers that I were referring to are the official numbers by the German government, but then there's also a monitoring instance that I will refer to also a bit later today. And then there have been extreme loud discussions, especially in the German cultural scene around issues of anti-Semitism. And this, I think, kind of also alludes to the fact that there is that anti-Semitism, and especially the accusation of being an anti-Semite or holding anti-Semitic attitudes, is often being used by both ends of the political spectrum against each other. So you used the example of Hubert Aiwanger, and basically it was only the left that was calling out conservatives, and obviously the far right, for not calling out this very specific example of someone who in his past shared vile anti-Semitic tropes. But then at the same time, when it comes to, for example, the German cultural scene, many people argue that the German, or so-called German left, seems to also be blind on that eye, and that it's mostly conservatives and folks on the right who are calling out people for their, in some cases, biases, but also vile anti-Semitism. And the last example here could be public discourse around both what definitions should be used when referring to anti-Semitism. Obviously, discourses around documenta that were, internationally known and so on. Then what you will also see on the list that I shared, and this is, I've come to an end here, obviously Halle was a turning point in Germany. I think that the vast violence that was shown both in Halle and then later also in Hanau were a bit of a wake-up call to German society as such, because many people, in fact, or especially in public discourse, anti-Semitism was still seen as something of the past. Commemoration culture, however, and combating anti-Semitism are very often being mixed up in Germany. So many people fall for the false trend, so to say, of thinking that if they remember the past, this could serve as a vaccine against anti-Semitism today, which of course leads to many people in the Jewish community saying that many Germans only care about dead Jews, but that in fact living Jews hold little to no place in public discourse. Thanks.
Thank you a lot, Ben. I think it indeed was very interesting what you said about the far right, the right accusing the left of not recognizing anti-Semitism and vice versa. Those cross accusations are indeed happening not only in Germany, but in many other countries. Before giving the floor to our next speaker, I forgot to mention that in the end, we have, there will be 15-20 minutes for a discussion with the questions from the public. So feel free to ask your question in the Q&A section. I will now give the floor to Brigitte Stora. In your previous book, you have talked about the sense of loneliness of Jews in France after the Second Intifada. And in your last book, the fil rouge, the common thread, is connecting all forms of anti-Semitism and in general the sensation of otherness, of alterity of Jews. As Anna was mentioning before, of Jews not finding their place in the society. So, Brigitte, can you tell us a bit about what is the state of the art of anti-Semitism in France? Thank you.
Alors, d'abord, je suis désolée, j'avais envisagé un petit peu comme un...
So I'm sorry. I'm going to treat this as a bit of a lecture, more than an actual conversation. Anti-Semitism exploded in France after October 7th. Over 1,500 acts were reported. And as I said in a previous book, the Jewish solitude or sense of aloneness of Jews who were on the left of the political spectrum, who felt that they were simply abandoned. And I've carried on with this line of thinking. So I'm sorry, it's a bit of a lecture. So just tell me to stop if you get fed up, and I will try to do it in English.
Nothing new. Of course, there is no such thing as new. Comment? Ah, j'entends autre chose en même temps. Bon. Okay, there is no new anti-Semitism any more than there is anti-Semitism on the left, on the right, Muslim, etc. Alors, je vais quand même couper l'audio, peut-être.
Sorry, I'm going to cut off my own audio, says Brigitte, because I'm hearing myself.
Looking anti-Semitism in the face means, first of all, confronting the dizziness of its perpetuity. And it's perhaps this vertigo that many would like to avoid. Reflection on the new anti-Semitism has most often been part of a reactionary discourse, that of the West's cultural war against Islam, instead of a democratic fight against Islamist terrorism. The left, as I said, has not been up to the task of solidarity with Jews, and a large part of the extreme left has been complicit to it. This fight against anti-Semitism often was taken by the conservative right, which saw in it the opportunity to embark the Jewish name in its Christian West identity crusade, fighting new barbarities. The proponent of new anti-Semitism referred to the new speakers of anti-Semitism rather than the very old language that they all speak in common. And it seems to me that you just have to listen to this speech. And I wonder very often why this anti-Semitic discourse is not listened to. Because anti-Semitism is first of all a discourse, always the same, a language that many people use, whatever their origin, sex, skin color, or political position, sometimes without realizing they do. And that is being spoken again and again, almost all over the world. He says that Jews are guilty people, the most guilty of the world, entirely on the side of privilege and despoilment, and that they have stolen the future of humanity. The idea of global Jewish conspiracy to rule the world is the central and structural theme of every anti-Semitism. It was the common denominator and the link between the hatred of the Rothschilds and the Judeo-Bolsheviks, which was the basis of Nazi propaganda. Today, we have a new version on this with, on the far right, the idea that Jews would be like George Soros, the vectors of the Great Replacement. And on the other side, there's the idea that Jews and Israel would dominate international finance and imperialism. It's always the big Jewish peril that threatens the harmony of the world. Despite this longevity of this fountain, despite the constancy of anti-Semitic propaganda, Jew in literature showing a Jew holding the world in his hand, despite the title of the books, until the renewed diffusion of the Protocol of the Elders of Zion, relayed always today by thousands of conspiracy sites, this nodal dimension of anti-Semitism is always curiously evaded, as if it was inaudible. Yet this murderous myth of Jewish conspiracy, which makes anti-Semitism as a legitimate defense against the threat, is at the heart of anti-Semitic discourse, whatever who speaks it. Extreme right and Islamists claim the protocol of the Elder of Zion. The fantasy of Jewish domination and the spoliation of people that it induced was redeployed after the war as if it had not been the central argument of Nazism, and as if the extermination of the Jews had not constituted its cruelest denial. Far, well beyond the racial dimension, Nazi propaganda already aimed first and foremost to free itself from Jewish domination, the famous Weltjudentum. The meat is at the heart of Holocaust denial, Islamist, the discourse of the extreme right and its national populist variation, but it's also very often present in most anti-Zionist discourse and appears as a thread in a certain decolonial or even alter globalist discourse that emphasizes domination, a domination that is more often abstract and that is not afraid to place the name of Israel of its center. Hatred of Israel. I'm not talking about the legitimate criticism of Israel, still less about the real responsibility of its current government and the massacres in Gaza. I'm talking about hatred of Israel, which has become the name of an irrational rage that has become central, even nodal, not only, as I say, in many white supremacism, Islamist, this transversality and the centrality of this detestation, like no other, have no equal. A guilty people at the root of everything. Antisemitism is not a series of prejudices. It is a vision of the world at the roots of the Western tradition. Anne Frank, in her book, she wrote, "Who made us Jews so exceptional among peoples? Who made this guilty name the cause of the world's misfortunes?" Christianity, as Camus said, of course, Christianity, or to be more precise, the church, is not only a religion, but also a civilization, founded on the denial of its own origins, making a single people in the world the culprit for the discord and misfortunes of the world. A dead Jew is worshipped just as much as living Jews are hated. For centuries, this accusation of deicide was used to justify massacres and pogrom. 2,000 years of fake news, it's a long time. Anti-Judaism is a worldview at the origin of the Western tradition that postulates the abolition of Judaism as a condition for universal redemption. The American historian David Nirenberg,
Brigitte, if I can stop you, you still have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay,
Yeah.
so okay.
Thank you.
Even, I mean, although the Catholic Church has made a real effort to repent, many people continue, sometimes unwittingly, to draw on this ancestral imagination. Even Stalinist anti-Semitism denounced Slonsky or Solomon Michoels as Judah. Whatever it speaks, and the cause it claims to defend, the anti-Jewish discourse has been deploying a similar language and themes for centuries, even though it regularly believes it is inventing it. Thus, and I will stop this, the idea carried by the fascists and many decolonial, widely shared, that we are doing too much with the Shoah, is not new. The reproach that the Jews are pulling wool over their eyes is linked on the founding idea of spoliation and domination. This was Stalin's arguments for banning the Black Book in 1947, that Jewish misfortune should not be brought to light because it would harm others. We could speak about the influence of Stalinist anti-Semitism, who played a major role in the return to the 21st century. My book is speaking about something else, about the link between this original otherness and the fight for emancipation, because I'm really convinced that we have nothing to oppose anti-Semitism other than our hope in a human brotherhood, other than links between a fight against anti-Semitism and all kinds of injustices. Because I think that it means never sacrificing the other, because only full recognition of the other is the condition for universality. Sorry. And thank you for your patience.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you a lot, Brigitte, for your all the things you put on the plate. And now to conclude the first round, I will ask maybe Gadi, Luzzatto, Voghera to tell us a bit about the situation in Italy, maybe also by providing data from the observatory monitoring anti-Semitism, but you're free to.
Thank you for the freedom. Thank you for inviting me and for this open discussion. I will not repeat many of the things that the other colleagues said about anti-Semitism. Maybe something is lacking in this discussion. I think this a definition of anti-Semitism. We have on the table, on the floor, three main definitions. One, the working definition of anti-Semitism of the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and the others are two definitions coming from the academy, let's say. One, the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, and one, the Nexus definition. And all the three definitions are very, very different and very criticized from many sides. I think we have to start from two main points. At the moment, I think anti-Semitism, both in Italy and in other countries, is mainly a political language coming from a basis of unrooted prejudice. The experience in Italy is very similar to the Polish one and also of the French one, that is coming from a very deep anti-Judaism and rooted in the Christian teachings over the centuries. And like in Poland, we can say that we have now in Italy, we have only 2,000 of Jews living in Italy. So a very, very little community, mainly based in Rome and in Milan. So we can easily speak about an anti-Semitism without Jews. That is a public discourse, very, very useful for the public language and for the political affairs, but not very effective for the lives of the Jews in general. Yes, Brigitte is right when she says that Jews feel very lonely and very isolated in these moments after October 7th. Anti-Semitism in contemporary age in Italy comes directly from the state. You know that we had an anti-Semitism based on the state laws. The fascist regime published and embodied important racial laws against Jews that excluded Jews from most of the sectors of the Italian society, from schools, from universities, from public offices, from the army. To Jews were forbidden to own too large companies and so on. But more than this, the fascist regime, and that was the Italian state at the moment, educated Italians to hate Jews. Anti-Semitism became in 1939 the main topic of the main book adopted by public schools everywhere in Italy. The second book of the fascists educated Italians to the values of racism and of anti-Semitism. So when we see with in the communication, in the newspapers and public entities saying with surprise that in Italy there is a rising and unexpected anti-Semitism, they don't take in account that only 80 years ago, our people was educated to the value of anti-Semitism. And it's quite a different between Italy and other countries. Maybe Vichy has had same experiences, but very few years, and Germany, of course, we know, but they work on this. After the war, anti-Semitism did not disappear. We saw a rising of a wave of nostalgic neo-fascist and neo-Nazi anti-Semitism in the years 60s and 70s. And in the years 80s, we saw, and I personally fought, a rising of a wave of anti-Semitism from the left. Very similar to the one we see after October the 7th. At the beginning, in 1982, we suffered many terror attacks, direct terror attacks to Jewish communities, to the center of our center of studies in Milan, and also to a synagogue with a child killed by Palestinian terrorists. Our surveys are very similar to the German one. We are recording from many years constant level of what we call poor anti-Semites. 10–12% of people who is responding with aggression, with aggressive moods to every solicitation on Israel, Jews, Judaism, and so on. So, and this is a permanent level of anti-Semitism coming from the surveys in confrontation with the rising also in Italy of the level of physical attacks after October the 7th, not at the level of the French experience, but very similar. That's
okay. Thank you a lot to all our speakers, and I invite again the shy participants, if they want to write questions in the chat, feel free to write them in the Q&A section. And now for this second part, I was thinking that I think it's okay. The situation is not very bright, but in the past years and decades, some things have been implemented by governments, but also by civil societies to counter anti-Semitism. So I would maybe ask our speakers to tell us a bit more about the strategies that are put in place to counter anti-Semitism and which ones should be but are not yet implemented. Of course, without wanting to find a solution to anti-Semitism in the time of a webinar, but I think it would still be relevant to share some good practices. I'm thinking of the establishment of coordinators for the fight against anti-Semitism, the progress of legislation to combat online and offline hate speech, as Gadi and Anna were mentioning, the IRA definition, which is also a bit controversial, of anti-Semitism by the European and national parliaments, but also the role of European Jewish culture and other initiatives that try to bring societies closer to the Jewish culture. I would start again by Anna. I know you are convinced that the strategic approach focusing on intersectionality in education is vital, both about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, but also about other forms of discrimination and in general intersectionality. Maybe if you want to start answering my question, also by talking about the project Stories That Move, but the floor is yours.
Okay, so maybe I will so maybe I will start in the terms of national level. So IRA definition was endorsed by the Polish government in 2021. Polish government is a part of IRA as well. In the Polish curriculum and also in the textbooks, they are the information about the Holocaust, about Jews. When I was analyzing textbooks in 2016, like unfortunately, the first information from the history lessons with kids gained from the schools was that Jews killed the Christ. It was not even that Jews were blamed to kill the Christ, but on the other hand, at that time, there were also information about the pogroms caused by Poles, etc. So it was much more objective in that regard. A situation has changed after 2015 when there was the shift in the government. So in the terms of good practices, maybe we can call it that way. So most of the schools are visiting the memory places as the Auschwitz State Museum as memory place, like to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust. Kids all taught about the Holocaust. Kids all taught about the anti-Semitism. There's a cooperation with the civil society organizations right now, as we have the new government. So there was we have such a minister as the equality minister, which will be responsible for the provision of the inclusion, equality in the terms of education, and not only in cooperation among the minorities. So there's a lot of good practices in the terms of the local governments, and there's a lot of good practices which we can share in the terms of the Poland, also like in the by the experts, like the local governments here and the cities were called like the bastions of the democracies when like Poland was challenge in the terms of democracy, but also like in the terms of the government, like OSCE addressed that like incumbent president in the previous presidential election was using anti-Semitic rhetoric during his campaign and also homophobic rhetoric. So it's so important like to address some of the aspect of the strategy in the terms of combating anti-Semitism and its intersectionality in that regards. As you can see in that aspect, that like the homophobia and anti-Semitism was used like to gain the support from the certain group of the voters. So that is in the terms of the good practice. There's like the one of the biggest museum in Warsaw, Poland Museum, which also like is the State Museum, and there's a lot of like work among those workers, which is implemented in the schools. Also like the schools are have the possibility to send their teachers like to the trainings in the terms of like the anti-Semitism, etc. But even though that like for about 20 years there is an education about the Holocaust in the terms of anti-Semitism, like the level of the anti-Semitism is still the same size, right? Also like in the terms of Islamophobia, there is a huge level of Islamophobia and like Romophobia as well. So there's and also like we are facing the challenge of like of the witness and the survivors of the Holocaust, which are passing, right? So like and also the memory of the traumatic events, which like exist among the Jewish community for about 5 generations. For those who did not experience trauma, it exists 3 generations. So there is also like the perception of the education, which like for the Jewish community is much more painful, it's much more emotional, and in the terms of the not Jewish population, it's much more facts oriented education. So like teaching about the Holocaust is the same as the teaching about the ancient Egypt in that regard. So how we will raise the empathy. So like the one of the source like to raise the empathy is like this intersectional aspect of the teaching of the discrimination, like to feel the discrimination like close to your body, right? Like the shirt needs to be close to your skin. So how the young kids would never see like the Jewish neighbor or like the Jewish friend could emphasize with the victims of the Holocaust or the victims of the anti-Semitism, but rather like he or she would address the intersectional aspect of the discrimination, because his or her friends would be the victim of the discrimination because he or she is fat bones, right? Or like wearing the glasses, or like he's a member of the different groups. So like in that aspect, as like the tool which we were using, as it was mentioned already, like the stories that move, was putting the emphasis like on the education on the Holocaust, but still use this as the pillar to the experience of the different groups which experience the discrimination, hatred, hate crimes, and hate speech. So how we can use this sense of empathy, like to learn something, like to do our homework, right? So yes, so they are like the challenges which we need to face, and it will be like problematic in that regard.
Thank you a lot, Anna. Indeed, the topic of how to communicate about things such as the Holocaust to people who haven't experienced themselves or their family or their background is indeed a challenge in the fight against anti-Semitism, but also about the memory of the Holocaust. I would now ask to Gadi, Luzzatto, Voghera again to maybe to talk about some good practices, but in particular maybe if you want to start, what has changed since the institution of EU and national coordinators on combating anti-Semitism and the adoption of the IRA definition? Maybe, I don't know, have you seen any changes? What is your perception?
Yes, I will answer your question, but I will answer also directly one of the questions, the first one that is rightly connected with this. And I think I will try to answer. Yes, we established Italy, the Italian government under the Draghi rule, established and the role of national coordinator for the fight against anti-Semitism. And the first coordinator wrote with many experts, let's say, a national strategy against anti-Semitism, and in the same time a guideline for teaching about anti-Semitism at school. It has been very effective. It suscitated a lot of interest from teachers, and it began to elaborate many programs on teaching about anti-Semitism. And connected with the European strategy, we had the occasion to begin working on many different European projects related to anti-Semitism. The names are not important for the audience, and in establishing also many networks. One is with Anna and ENCATE, and but many others also with other institutes in Germany and in other countries. We have developed from that point. Now the coordinator changed during the last years. We have now the third one. His name is, I don't remember because I don't know him in person because he is very new. And he is directly, yes, this is important for answering one of the questions. He is one of the answers of the right-wing government in Italy now. Right-wing parties in Italy are confronting with and challenging anti-Semitism. They are interested in challenging anti-Semitism. They are very different parties. And they have some of these parties have in their bodies some parts of, let's say, rhetoric, anti-Semitic rhetoric, but in the same time they try to demonstrate sympathy and to Jewish community. To Jewish communities in general, they offer a lot of money for developing of programs in general. They use the tool of, let's say, the phrase, we are so friends of Israel, so we are not anti-Semites. That is not true. It's much more complicated. But the issue they are working on mainly is the issue of security. This is why they appointed the new coordinator of for the fight against anti-Semitism, taking him directly from the secret services and from the Carabinieri, that is a part of the Italian army, and it's police mainly. So this is how the main way in which the Italian right-wing government works on anti-Semitism in general.
Thank you a lot, Gadi, also for answering the first of the questions. I wrote the name of the new coordinator in the chat. He's indeed very new. He was appointed on January the 4th. So you have just talked about the institutional ways to combat it. I know that Brigitte, you are personally engaged in a lot of networks, among them the Warriors for Peace, the RAR, the Network of Action Against Racism and Antisemitism. And if you want also to give a French perspective of what could be the good practices, maybe by starting talking about the role played by such networks and alliances. You can talk in French or in English, it's the same.
En France, les pouvoirs publics protègent.
In France, the state protects synagogues and Jewish institutions. There's no problem with the head of state who is liberal, I mean, in the sense that he's center-right, but he's quite vigilant about this. And then there's the organization that handles the fight against discrimination. There are many organizations, there are museums, so there are many things being done, and I think that's a very good thing. And while I think it's a good thing, I don't know how to say this without opening up a whole discussion. The relationship to the remembrance of the Shoah is something that I think is somewhat perilous or dangerous, because it's a way of saying this is anti-Semitism. It's the gas chambers. And then the reaction can be anything that's not as bad as that is not so serious, as if Hitler had put the bar so high that anything that's less than that is relatively minor. And then the second question here is the question of guilt. As you know, in Germany, you have been working on secondary anti-Semitism that connected to the feeling of guilt about the Shoah. We hear this in the discourse about Nazifying the Jewish or Nazifying Israel to try to simply erase the feeling of guilt. And I don't think this is where we need to be working or focusing our efforts. I think if there's an area where we need to focus is not knowledge or culture, because as we all know, Germany was far from being the most backwards country in the world. And it was at the heart of Europe, and we can never forget this. Culture is, education is one thing, but it's not the same as values. So before, when I was saying that anti-Semitism is a way of seeing the world with a certain type of discourse, I want to say, I don't want to talk to those who are anti-Semitic. I want to speak with those who continue to use this language without even realizing that they're using this language. I want to tell them, do you realize what you're doing? There's a long story in Italy, But there's a story of anti-Judaism. It's 2,000 years old, and I never tire of saying it. And just like the feminists or the anti-racists and the anti-colonials have all said, it's not just about prejudice. It's not just about bad behavior. It's about the structures of patriarchal structures that need to justify slavery or colonialism or what have you. We have to show the very structural nature of this. And I'm very surprised by the fact that decolonization studies haven't decided to look at this more carefully and to look more specifically at what it means. And then you talked about the Warriors for Peace. And then there are all forms of racism that are always establishing these kinds of links, because that link is interesting. Up until now, the Jews were not fighting against anti-Semitism. They didn't worry about it. And now we're seeing more and more people, be they Jewish or not, who consider that the fight against anti-Semitism is part of the fight for emancipation, the fight of the left. And that's new. And even if there are not that many of us, there's some young people who are trying to break out of this feeling of aloneness and clearly showing that we're all in the same situation. We were somewhat abandoned by the left, and indeed, our fight was sort of picked up by the right. So it's very important for people such as myself. It's a way also of putting the Jews in danger, because in a way, it's placing them there where the anti-Jewish imaginary or imagination is, how I put them, that is on the side of privilege, on the side of domination. So solidarity, the fact that these fights are all connected, and to talk about racism and anti-Semitism at the same time, and saying that we're all together, we're not on the outside. And some young Jewish young people on the left are saying this, carrying this banner, and I think that's very important. It's giving us new hope.
Thank you a lot, Brigitte. And now the last intervention before the Q&A session. I've seen there are already a few questions. As Brigitte was saying in her first intervention, there is no anti-Semitism which doesn't come from some form of conspiracy theory. So maybe I will ask Benny. Of course, I know you know Katharina von Schnurbein, and you're well aware of a lot of good practices in Germany and around Europe to combat anti-Semitism. But maybe I think it's interesting also for our audience to maybe discover the concept of dog whistles, of racist dog whistles. What are they? What are the most common ones in Germany? How to recognize them, and why is it important to recognize them, and what we can do to counter.
Thank you, Benjamin. I try to stick to the given 7 minutes. But please do give me a bit of a signal, because I think both theory is needed, but then also maybe a few very concrete examples. Let me maybe start by, because so far we didn't speak about it, but I think at this point it maybe would make sense to also highlight from what position I do take also as a professional. So today I do work for a foundation, and there I focus a lot on building initiatives that try to strengthen democracy online in a wider sense. And in that case, I focus a lot on online hate, conspiracy ideologies, online participation, and also disinfo. And we do fund projects really all over the world, but especially also in Europe. And I mean, I look at you, Anna, and Gadi, and one of the upcoming initiatives that I might also allude to is actually also in cooperation with your institutions, if I'm not entirely wrong. When it comes to combating anti-Semitism, I do like to use the term safeguarding, which is a lot more common. Actually, when it comes to combating any form of hate or working with, minority groups, safeguarding is a terminology that is often being used in Great Britain, Australia, I think Ireland. It's not so common necessarily in the US American context, but it consists of 6 different approaches that try to holistically basically strengthen the stand of an affected group within society. And I think we should take this into consideration when speaking about combating any form of hate. And then secondly, it's also important to understand that anti-Semitism today takes the shape or tends to change its appearance according to what is happening in society. So many of the larger questions that we need to answer as a society also do have a direct effect on how we deal with anti-Semitism. And conspiracy ideologies are a perfect example for that. I do agree with many of the things that Brigitte said. Why are conspiracy ideologies such, and also disinfo, such an important topic to us? When we speak about online regulation, in fact, there is good legislation when it comes to illegal content online. This is no one's problem. The only problem that we face here is really about the rule of law, as in making sure that the good legislation that is in place can be carried out in online environments. And we do get better here as a European society. But the real challenge that we face is content that tends to be referred to as awful but lawful. So it's not illegal to speak about an elite that is behind any form of evil within society. And this is where I'm now slowly also getting to what to dog whistling. The most harmful content that, the one content that affects elections on this continent, the one content that tends to lead to people leaving online rooms, maybe leaving political discourse, very, very often is actually lawful. It's not illegal to post these things. So when we speak about best practices in combating anti-Semitism, we should also speak about best practices in combating illegal hate, because, and these are the facts from at least the last larger study that was carried out, you referred to Katharina von Schnurbein. She was very much involved in setting up the study. It's from the Fundamental Rights Agency of 2018. 89% of European Jews agree with the fact that anti-Semitism is a rising problem in their everyday life. And the exact same amount, 89%, say that this problem lies especially online. So many of the work that I do, whether I want to or not, still evolves around anti-Semitism. The difference between anti-Semitism and racism here, and we take intersectional approaches in all of our work. And I always, I got to know Anna back in Brussels through, alliances that we built between the Roma and the Armenian communities. So I'm very much familiar with building alliances. But the difference between anti-Semitism and racism being that racism in its DNA implies the action of pushing down, whereas anti-Semitism often refers to the idea of pushing up. So against a so perceived elite. And this obviously is the ultimate conspiracy that we're so familiar with. Especially in the German context, but especially also after 7th of October, dog whistling is probably one of the things to look out for when it comes to trying to better one's own behavior, but maybe also better political discourse. We do not need historical comparison when speaking about the Israeli-Arab conflict. They very, very often don't benefit the discussion. If anything, they rather harm discussions. And especially when it comes to comparisons to the Nazi era, but also, comparisons with apartheid, it's such an emotionally charged conflict that using historical comparison from a purely factual aspect, from a purely strategic perspective, I'm not going into facts here, it doesn't benefit the discussion. So I'd rather suggest to simply not use it. The question of definitions was raised. Also, dog whistling happens when it comes to the application of definitions. There's one definition that was applied by 40 plus governments. Every Jewish community around the planet agrees on using one definition. And I think we need to have a discussion on how the IRA working definition is being applied. I think it's being misused. It has been misused. And that is one of the main reasons for why there's so much controversy around the definition as such. But that doesn't mean that the definition as such is wrong. And what we see happening right now a lot is that, especially when it comes to the Jerusalem Declaration, you know, whenever it seems comfortable, people refer to a definition that serves them. The problem here lies that essentially this is a form of collective gaslighting, at least when it comes to the Jewish community. Because if the community as such agrees on their own definition of how discrimination looks like, we should listen to them just the same way we listen to every other community when being affected. And this is again where the term of safeguarding comes into place. To conclude, on 3 levels, I would suggest to think about best practices. The first one literally is about protection. We heard about the physical protection, of the physical security of Jewish life. That is a necessity. And we should not forget that very often funds are needed here. Securing Jewish life costs a lot of money. And without this money, Jewish life cannot happen. Monitoring being the other case. We cannot speak about the phenomenon of anti-Semitism if we don't have concrete numbers. And both Anna and also Gadi's work, but also the work of RIAS, the organization that I referred to in my previous comments, but also in the chat. Those are best practices. And this is actually a best practice that is now being taken to the next level by adopting a European standard, a reporting standard, so that we can finally start comparing the numbers that we track in Germany with the numbers that we track in Poland, with the numbers that we track in Austria, because there are different criminal codes in place, but the way that we monitor anti-Semitism as such shouldn't be affected by that. The second level then would be strengthening civil society, and that has to do both with empowering the community as such, but especially civil society actors that try to strengthen the discourse as such. So obviously alliances come into place. Anti-Semitism cannot be a problem that needs to be solved by the Jews if they are the most affected. Nothing new that I'm saying here. And then thirdly, really, and this is probably the hardest, it really comes down to how we try to shape the society that we want to live in. So how do we combat online hate? How do we manage to make sure that violence in the Middle East doesn't spill over every time that something is happening there? We have the statistics, we have the data, and yet we are not able to avoid this. In my community, Molotov cocktails were thrown on a synagogue right after the 7th of October. There is no good reason for why this is happening, and at the same time, it is a question of security. Then again, as in why aren't we prepared? You know, Halle, and this is, you know, these are things that member states are still a bit slow in adapting. Training judges, training police, personnel in the executive, and that is of vital importance. If the police officer that comes to a crime scene is unable to detect what anti-Semitism looks like, it might have drastic effects on both the victim, but also the legal outcome in the end. If judges are unable to recognizing anti-Semitism when it appears, and there are hundreds of examples that I could bring now just from Germany that are absurd, really absurd, then it leads to a problem. It also leads to the fact that people don't go to the courts. Maybe a last statistic that I'd refer to here: only 5 to 7% of the anti-Semitic incidents that were recorded between 2018 and 2022 that could have been brought to court were actually reported to the police. 5 to 7%. That's a number that is similar with other minorities, but it does showcase two things: that A, there's little trust in people actually getting help, and B, that that people are either unaware of their rights or do not possess the stamina to go into the process of taking legal action. And this is a basic question of the rule of law that is not specific to anti-Semitism. Many, many things that I mentioned, and I do look forward to the discussion with everyone.
Thank you a lot, Ben. Indeed, you put a lot of food for thought for me, for us, the audience. 2 questions have been asked in the Q&A, and 2 answers have been provided already by some of the panelists, but I think it's still relevant maybe to reread them in order also if other panelists want to complement the answers. The first one is about how the far right in power in Italy and in Poland is dealing with the question of anti-Semitism. Anna has already answered, but if you want to add something, or maybe Gadi also giving the perspective from Italy, and then another question about the revenge accusation of genocide to Israel used actually in Italy, but not only, as a strong and dangerous arm against Jews and as a mean of negationism of the Shoah. Again, it has been answered, but I think it's maybe useful for everyone to hear from your mouth. And I also have a personal question for Benny. It was interesting, you mentioned before the differences between anti-Semitism between East and West Germany. Is it still relevant today, and how does it work? So you're free to answer. I don't know who wants to speak first.
I think I answered the first one, and the second one I answered by in writings. What I wanted to add, I think, is that must be clear that anti-Semitism is not only dangerous for Jews, and we know, but it's dangerous for democracy in general, and this is not clear to the general people in general. For instance. If we see that in Italy and in other places, it is dangerous for a Jew to attend a service in a synagogue, this is related to the freedom of religion. That is a principle of our constitution in Italy, but of the values in all over Europe. And the same way. If Jewish students and Israeli students who study in Europe feel themselves as insecure, as in danger, they feel the pressure, they don't attend classes because of menace, of pressure. This is the freedom of study in general that is in danger. That is another general value. And if many universities listen to the BDS, to the development of interrupting research program with the Israeli universities, this is the freedom of research that is mainly menaced by this kind of acts. And this is what anti-Semitism is doing to our society. So it must be clear that this is mainly a danger for our democracy.
I think, Anna, you can go next.
Yeah, just one thing I'd like to add what Gadi was saying. Like, I totally agree with you. It's like the question of also security in terms of democratization and democracy. Like, we have scientific analysis that someone who is anti-Semitic usually perceived in other groups the same, and like also like he's xenophobic or like racist, etc., etc. So the question is like if someone is like expressing the anti-Semitic ideas and opinions, because like that there's certain atmosphere in this landscape, right? Like the acceptance of the certain attitude. So like different terrorist attacks towards different groups, like usually the perpetrator would like on his statement, on his like call to action, there was like also anti-Semitic call as well, anti-Semitic statements. Like I was analyzing the hate speech towards women in politics. Like usually they were not Jewish women who were like very visible and active in the political scene, but they were always attacked in the terms of like anti-Semitism as well. So you can tell that and see that like it's interfering and it's like the threat to the democracy and the security itself of the country as well. Because like also like the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in UK, they analyzed the spectrum of the terrorist attack, and also like the situation after October 7, and like what is the scale of the hatred. So they've proved that the situation is used by the far right to mobilize those who are extremists, right, for their groups, and also in other groups. So yes, that's it.
Thank you a lot, Anna. Benny, I saw your hand.
Sure. So you did bring up a question that goes to my direction, I think, and then also I would comment on a few things, maybe giving more specific examples. Of course, it does make a difference. There are differences between East and West Germany still. I mean, we see it in voting behavior. The far right is basically kissing the 30% all over the former East, the former GDR. And there are many attempts at explaining this. I think it's mostly important to also listen to East German voices in this regard, I have to say. You did refer to Max Czolek, by the way, who's also a good friend of mine, who in fact is one of these East German voices. I think he could be a bit more outspoken on that, in that regard, by the way. There are others. I forgot her name. I will post her name into the chat. An extremely interesting perspective. A POC. She's a black woman that did grow up in the former GDR, and speaks a lot about the self-perception as of the former East, and how it affects people's reception of racism, minorities in general. So when it comes to formalizing political strategy, I think East Germany could serve as a good example of what could be done or what should be done, which is go to the locals, ask some of the local political activists on how to do things, because especially West German voices are not being heard to. And one of the things that most extremists have in common, by the way, no matter the spectrum, is their distrust of mainstream media. This is why messenger services are so problematic. And this brings me then to the other best practice that I wanted to share. The very first organization that I funded from within my department, within the foundation, actually we did build it, is called CIMAS, the Center for Monitoring, Analysis and Strategy. They are very often being referred to as a best practice from Germany and Austria. And what they do is they engage in real-time monitoring of fringe platforms. So you could, one could think about them as, so basically you have a dashboard that shows you what's going on in some of these very radical communities within a certain area. And that is an extremely important tool to use. It obviously also is a tool that can be misused. Now, very important, something that has been misused, especially by the far right, because many liberal Democrats missed the chance of conquering the online realm. So this is an organization that I really would refer to as a best practice. Obviously, they do cooperate a lot with the ISD, Anna, both in the UK and also here in Germany, whereas the ISD is a bit more of a political institution. CIMAS is delivering the data, so to say, and formalizing actually strategy on how to use it, almost forecasting what's about to happen. Now, all of these organizations, both the ISD and CIMAS, that do not necessarily put a focus in their work on anti-Semitism, have a vast focus on anti-Semitism, have specialists on anti-Semitism, because they started understanding that they cannot work against disinfo and conspiracy ideologies without understanding anti-Semitism and fighting it. And I think this is very telling. And that, by the way, goes for many European countries.
Thank you a lot, Benny. We still have 4 minutes. Brigitte, if you want to add some last remarks or complementing answers.
Non, le conspirationnisme, enfin, on en a
No, conspiracy theories, and we talked about a little bit, conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism speak the same language. The first one says there's one entity that's guilty for the ills of the world, and the other ones is naming or pointing to the original culprit that everybody knows. We don't even need to name it. And that's why you have all the dog whistling. There were protests in France, for instance, against the vaccination restrictions during COVID, and they held up placards that simply said who ? Who is controlling the pharmaceutical labs? And as we know, we live in a society, or we live in a world, in a cultural world, where the guilty one, when you say who is guilty, it's the Jew. And we need to be able to say this, because we won't be able to find a way out if we don't say it. We realize that with the Jewish people, there's always some exceptionalism, and anything that ends up being accepted, for instance, on the left. So, you can only speak for your own group. For instance, women can only talk about what happens to women. Same thing for homophobia or racism. We know all these ideas. Amongst the progressive camp, this is accepted, but the Jewish voice on anti-Semitism is not only inaudible, but is suspect. And this is where we have to do a work of deconstruction within these fights. And when I mean within the fights, is because I think, and here I'm going back to that basic idea, is there a new form of anti-Semitism? Can we ally with the right in the fight against anti-Semitism? I'm convinced that that's not possible. We must clean up, and there's a lot of work to be done in those camps for those who will fight against all other forms of injustice and who think that social transformation, who believe in equality. And I think there is work to be done. And we have to make that connection, that link between these fights, not because you want to sort them out in terms of order of importance. So the fight against racism and anti-Semitism cannot be separated. Otherwise, you end up where we are today, where you basically have competition or opposition. You're either on one side or in one camp or the other. And that's not what we need to be doing in our world.
Thank you, Brigitte. Indeed, the separation of the causes between racism, anti-racism, and the fight against anti-Semitism is all often used, and this is something also we are to fight, and you are engaged in this fight. Thank you for that. I think it's the first webinar I participate where we are in time. So kudos to all of us, to the panelists especially, for sticking to the rules, let's say. Thank you again from me and from the Heinrich-Böll Stiftung in general for giving us and the audience your very precious perspective. It's Monday at 8:30, and we still have more than 40 people connected. So I think the things you have said have been extremely interesting and important. And I remember to everyone that this Zoom has been recorded, and it will be published on our website. So if you have friends or families who haven't been able to assist, we will be publishing it soon on our website. So thank you again to all our panelists, and there will be other webinars on this intertwine between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. So keep tuned for the next episodes.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Merci à vous.